Luna had seen some wild things in her 19 years of existence, but nothing quite compared to the controlled chaos of the Intergalactic Academy. The massive space station orbited between three dying stars, a testament to engineering hubris and political compromise that somehow managed to keep thousands of alien teenagers from various species in one piece. Well, mostly in one piece. Before we begin, YouTube shows me that 93% of you haven't subscribed yet. Subscribing is free, it really supports our community, and I'd love for you to be part of it. Also, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. The medical bay did stay busy. She adjusted her position in the uncomfortable chair, designed apparently for beings with entirely different spinal structures, and watched Professor Veltar attempt to maintain order in what could generously be called a classroom. The Altarian educator stood nearly 3 meters tall, his silver-scaled hide catching the artificial light as he gestured with 4 graceful arms toward the holographic display floating above his desk. Today, we shall examine the delicate art of interspecies negotiation, Veltar announced, his voice carrying that peculiar harmonic quality that made Altarians such effective diplomats. The key to successful galactic relations lies not in dominance, but in understanding. A low rumble of disagreement emanated from the section where the Kethrin students clustered. These bear-like beings, with their thick auburn fur and perpetually narrowed eyes, had opinions about dominance that differed significantly from their professor's philosophy. Luna had been observing them for weeks now, noting how they moved in packs, how their conversations always seemed to involve some form of posturing, and how they treated every interaction as a potential challenge. Grax, the largest of the Kethrin cubs, shifted in his reinforced seat and muttered something in his native tongue that made his companions snicker. Luna's translator implant helpfully informed her that he'd just compared the professor's wisdom to the intellectual capacity of a space slug. Charming. Mr. Grax, Professor Veltar said without turning around, his secondary eyes apparently having caught the disruption. Perhaps you'd care to share your thoughts with the entire class? The Kethrin cub straightened, his massive frame making the chair creak ominously. Just wondering why we're wasting time learning to talk pretty when strength speaks louder than words, Professor. A few students shifted uncomfortably. The Nimari, those delicate bird-like beings who could barely reach Luna's shoulder, drew closer together in their corner. Vex, the Vorthak youngling whose insectoid features twitched with nervous energy, clicked his mandibles in what Luna had learned was their species' equivalent of clearing one's throat. Strength without wisdom is merely destruction, young Grax. Veltar replied, his tone patient, but carrying an undertone that suggested his patience had limits. Any being can break things. It takes intelligence to build them. Grax's lips pulled back, revealing teeth that evolution had clearly designed for ripping things apart rather than philosophical discussions. Easy words from someone whose species hasn't had to fight for survival. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by a few degrees. Even Luna, who prided herself on staying out of interspecies drama, felt her attention sharpen. This was heading somewhere unpleasant and fast. Professor Veltar's 4 arms moved in a gesture that Luna's cultural studies had taught her was the Altarian equivalent of counting to 10. The Altarian people have faced our share of challenges, Mr. Grax. We simply chose to meet them with our minds rather than our claws. And how's that working out for your birth rates? Grax shot back, earning another round of snickers from his pack. The insult hit its mark. Luna winced internally. The declining Altarian population was a sensitive topic across the galaxy. Their peaceful nature and focus on intellectual pursuits had led to a demographic crisis that threatened their species' long-term survival. It was a low blow, even by Kethrin standards. Veltar's scales shifted color slightly, a sign of emotional disturbance that he quickly controlled. We are here to learn, not to trade insults. Perhaps we should focus on— Focus on what? Grax interrupted, rising from his chair with fluid, predatory grace. Learning how to be weak? How to talk our enemies to death? His gaze swept the classroom, lingering on each non-Kethrin student with obvious disdain. Look around, Professor. Half these species wouldn't last a day in real space without someone stronger protecting them. Luna found herself leaning forward slightly. She'd seen this dynamic before, not in space, but in the schoolyards and military training facilities of Earth. The bully establishing dominance, testing boundaries, seeing how far he could push before someone pushed back. The difference was, most of these alien students seemed genuinely intimidated by Grax's display. Nimble, the small Nimari student, actually trembled when Grax's attention fell on her. Her feathered crest flattened against her skull in a display of pure submission. Flux, the crystalline quartzian, shifted their geometric form to present a smaller profile, light refracting through their body in patterns that suggested anxiety. Only Boom, the gentle giant from the Titan folk, seemed unaffected by Grax's posturing, but then again, when you stood 4 meters tall and had skin like living stone, few things probably seemed threatening. He continued working on his assignment with the focused determination that characterized his species, occasionally glancing up with what might have been concern. Mr. Grax, please return to your seat, Professor Veltar said, his harmonic voice carrying a note of authority that resonated through the chamber. This behavior is unbecoming of an academy student. For a moment, Luna thought the Kethrin might actually comply. His pack was watching him carefully, and she could sense the social dynamics at play. In their culture, backing down from authority could be seen as weakness, but openly defying a professor would have consequences. Grax chose poorly. Unbecoming, he repeated, his voice rising to a growl that made several students flinch. You know what's unbecoming, Professor? Pretending that all species are equal when clearly some of us are apex predators and others are prey. The classroom had gone completely silent now, save for the subtle hum of the station's life support systems. Even Kiksa, the other Kethrin student who usually tried to moderate her species mate's more aggressive tendencies, watched with wide eyes as Grax crossed lines that shouldn't be crossed. Professor Veltar straightened to his full height, all 4 arms moving in what Luna recognized as a formal challenge posture among Altarians. That is enough, young Grax. Your words shame not only yourself, but your entire— Don't. Grax's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper, his muscles bunching under his thick fur. Don't you dare lecture me about shame, Scaleback. The slur hung in the air like a poison cloud. Luna felt her own muscles tense involuntarily. She'd heard enough xenophobic language in her time to recognize hatred when she heard it, regardless of the species involved. Professor Veltar's scales shifted through a rapid spectrum of colors: surprise, hurt, anger, and finally a cold, controlled fury that made him suddenly seem far more dangerous than his peaceful reputation suggested. You will apologize immediately, or you will be removed from this academy. Grax laughed, not the amused chuckle of someone who found something funny, but the harsh bark of a predator who'd cornered its prey. Make me. The 2 words echoed through the chamber like a challenge thrown down in an ancient arena. Every student held their breath, waiting to see how this cosmic standoff would resolve itself. Professor Veltar's diplomatic training warred visibly with his natural instincts, his four hands clenching and unclenching as he struggled with the unprecedented situation. That's when Luna realized she was watching something historically significant unfold. Not just a classroom dispute, but a microcosm of the larger tensions that plagued galactic civilization. The eternal struggle between might and right, between the species that had clawed their way to the top of their respective food chains and those who had chosen a different path to sapience. And somehow, in this moment, with tensions crackling through the air like static electricity before a storm, Luna found herself thinking about her grandfather's old war stories, about moments when everything balanced on a knife's edge, when the actions of one person could change the course of history. She just hadn't expected to find herself in one of those moments while sitting in what was supposed to be a boring diplomatic protocol class. What happened next would have been laughable if it weren't so predictably tragic. Professor Veltar, clearly out of his depth in handling open rebellion, made the classic mistake of trying to salvage a deteriorating situation with bureaucracy. "Perhaps," he said, his harmonic voice strained but still maintaining that diplomatic calm, "we should redirect this energy into our group assignment. Nothing builds understanding like collaborative work." Luna almost groaned audibly. She'd seen this approach fail spectacularly in human institutions, and somehow doubted it would work any better with a room full of adolescent aliens whose evolutionary backgrounds ranged from pack hunters to hive minds. The professor's secondary arms gestured toward the holographic display, which obligingly shifted to show a complex diplomatic scenario. "Your task is to negotiate a trade agreement between three fictional species with conflicting resource needs. You'll work in mixed species groups to find mutually beneficial solutions." Grax's expression suggested he'd rather negotiate with a plasma torpedo. "And if we refuse?" "Then you fail the assignment, fail the class, and face disciplinary review," Veltar replied with what Luna suspected was forced confidence. "The Academy takes collaborative learning very seriously." The Kethrin cub's laugh was pure predator, all teeth and malice. "Fine, but I'm not working with weaklings." "The groups are pre-assigned," Professor Veltar announced, consulting his datapad with the air of someone delivering a death sentence. "Grax, you'll be working with Luna, Nimble, and Vex." The silence that followed could have been bottled and sold as a conversation killer. Luna found herself the focus of every eye in the room, most of them expressing sympathy for what they clearly viewed as her impending doom. Nimble actually made a small whimpering sound, while Vex's mandibles clicked rapidly in what she'd learned was panic. Grax turned his attention to Luna for the first time since class began, his yellow eyes narrowing as he assessed her. She could practically see the calculations running through his head. Small human female, no visible weapons, no apparent physical advantages. In his worldview, she probably ranked somewhere between easy prey and a minor inconvenience. "Well, well," he rumbled, moving toward her desk with that fluid grace that marked all successful predators. "Looks like I get to babysit the pets." Luna remained seated, her expression carefully neutral. She'd learned long ago that reacting to provocation usually made situations worse, not better. Instead, she pulled out her datapad and opened the assignment parameters, apparently focused on the work at hand. "Did you hear me, human?" Grax loomed over her desk, close enough that she could smell the predator musk that clung to his fur. "I said you're a pet." "I heard you," Luna replied without looking up from her screen. "I was choosing to ignore you." The casual dismissal hit Grax like a physical blow. His packmates exchanged glances, clearly uncertain how to react to a prey species that refused to show proper fear. In Catherine's social dynamics, ignoring a dominant individual was tantamount to declaring yourself either dead or dangerous. Grax clearly assumed she was simply too stupid to understand the threat. Maybe you don't get how this works, little human. Your species are farmers and merchants. We're warriors. That makes you— Tired of this conversation already, Luna interrupted, finally meeting his gaze with steady brown eyes that held no trace of the fear he expected. Are we going to work on this assignment, or are you planning to posture all afternoon? The room's collective intake of breath was audible. Even Professor Veltar paused in his attempts to organize the other groups, his attention drawn by the unprecedented sight of a human casually dismissing a Catherine threat display. Grax's response was swift and vicious. His massive hand swept across Luna's desk, scattering her carefully organized notes and sending her datapad flying. The device hit the floor with a crack that suggested expensive repairs in her immediate future. "Oops," he said with mock concern. "Guess you'll have to start over." Luna looked at her destroyed work, then back at Grax, her expression still remarkably calm. "That was my only copy of the research I've been doing for the past week." "Tragic," Grax replied, not bothering to hide his satisfaction. "Maybe next time you'll show proper respect to your betters." Nimble, who had been assigned to their group, actually started crying, soft, musical tones that her species used to express distress. Vex's chitin scraped against itself as he shifted nervously, his compound eyes darting between Luna and Grax like a spectator at a particularly violent sporting event. Professor Veltar finally intervened, his diplomatic training warring with obvious frustration. "Mr. Grax, that behavior is completely unacceptable. You will help Miss Luna reconstruct her research, and you will apologize for—" "I will do exactly nothing," Grax interrupted, his voice rising to a growl that made several students instinctively back away. "And if Scaleback here has a problem with that, he can file a complaint with the Academy administration. I'm sure they'll be very interested in his inability to maintain classroom order." The insult was calculated and cruel, striking directly at Veltar's professional competence. Luna watched the professor's scales shift through a rapid spectrum of colors, settling on a deep purple that her cultural studies suggested indicated profound embarrassment mixed with helpless rage. Other students began choosing sides, though not necessarily in the way Luna might have expected. Some of the more aggressive species, a few Vorthak younglings, a Quartzian, whose crystalline structure had shifted to display harsh, angular patterns, seemed to approve of Grax's dominance display. They whispered among themselves, casting calculating looks at their own group assignments. But the smaller, more peaceful species huddled together, clearly terrified that they might be next. Boom, the gentle Titan folk student rose to his considerable height and moved protectively closer to a cluster of Nimari students, his expression troubled. Luna found herself thinking about something her drill instructor had told her during basic training. The moment you let a bully establish dominance, you've lost. But the moment you meet force with force, you've also lost, because you're playing their game by their rules. She stood up slowly, ignoring the scattered remains of her work, and faced Grax directly. The height difference was significant. He towered over her by nearly a meter, but something in her posture made him pause. "You know what's interesting about Catherine pack dynamics?" she said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather. "The dominance displays are usually just that, displays. Real alphas don't need to destroy other people's work to prove their strength." Grax's eyes narrowed dangerously. You want to see real strength, human? I want to see real leadership, Luna replied. But I'm starting to think you don't know the difference. The challenge hung in the air between them, but it wasn't the crude physical confrontation Grax had been expecting. This was something more subtle, more dangerous to his carefully constructed image. She was questioning not just his actions, but his fundamental understanding of power itself. "You think you're clever," he snarled, moving closer until his massive frame blocked out most of the light. "You think your words can protect you when I decide to—" "When you decide to what?" Luna asked quietly. "Attack an unarmed student in front of witnesses? Prove that you can't handle intellectual challenges without resorting to violence? Show everyone here exactly what kind of leader you really are?" The questions hit like precision strikes, each one aimed at a different aspect of his self-image. Grax was clearly intelligent enough to recognize that she was backing him into a corner, but his cultural conditioning and personal psychology made retreat seem impossible. Professor Veltar watched the exchange with growing amazement, apparently recognizing that something unprecedented was happening in his classroom. The other students had gone completely silent, sensing that they were witnessing a moment that would be discussed and analyzed for years to come. That's when Grax made his fatal mistake. Cornered, humiliated, and desperate to reassert his dominance, he turned his attention to the weakest target available. "At least I'm not a pathetic little bird thing who can't even speak without crying," he growled, spinning toward Nimble with obvious violent intent. The small Nimari student froze in terror, her feathered crest flattening completely against her skull as Grax loomed over her. She was barely half his size, and her species had no natural defenses against predators beyond speed and camouflage, neither of which would help her in a confined classroom. "Leave her alone," Luna said, her voice carrying a note of command that cut through the tension like a blade. Grax whirled back toward her, his predator instincts finally snapping completely. "Or what, human? What exactly are you going to do about it?" Professor Veltar stepped forward, his diplomatic training finally giving way to protective instincts. "This has gone far enough, Mr. Grax. I am ordering you to—" That's when the Kethrin cub did the unthinkable. He turned toward his professor, his lips pulling back to reveal those evolutionary weapons that millions of years had designed for killing. And he snarled. Not the controlled growl of an annoyed predator, but the full-throated challenge snarl of a Kethrin declaring dominance over another being. In their culture, it was a sound reserved for mortal enemies and prey about to be killed. The room went dead silent. Every alien student understood the significance of what had just happened, even if the specifics varied between species. Grax had just committed an act of such profound disrespect toward authority that it transcended cultural boundaries. He had essentially declared war on the very concept of civilized behavior. Professor Veltar stood frozen, his forearms trembling slightly as he processed what had just occurred. In his long career as an educator, he had dealt with difficult students, challenging assignments, and complex interspecies dynamics. But never, not once, had a student shown him such naked, primal disrespect. And in that moment of shocked silence, every eye in the room turned toward Luna, waiting to see how the human would respond to a situation that had spiraled completely beyond the bounds of normal academic discipline. The answer would surprise them all. The silence stretched for exactly 3 heartbeats. Luna counted them, a habit ingrained by years of training that taught her to find calm in the center of chaos. 1 beat, Professor Veltar's scales cycling through colors of shock and outrage. 2 beats, every alien student holding their breath, waiting for security alarms or administrative intervention. 3 beats. Grax standing there with his fangs bared, apparently just now realizing he might have overplayed his hand. Then Luna spoke, and her voice carried across the classroom with the quiet authority of someone who had never needed to raise it to be heard. Apologize. 2 words. Simple, direct, unavoidable. They hung in the air with the weight of an ultimatum, cutting through the charged atmosphere like a knife through silk. Grax blinked, clearly caught off guard by the audacity of a human giving him orders. His packmates exchanged uncertain glances, their body language shifting from confident aggression to confused wariness. Even Professor Veltar seemed stunned by the unexpected intervention. "What did you just say to me?" Grax demanded, turning his full attention back to Luna. The threat in his voice was unmistakable, promising violence if she dared repeat her command. Luna met his yellow eyes without flinching, her brown gaze steady and uncompromising. "You heard me. Apologize to Professor Veltar. Now." The laugh that erupted from Grax was pure disbelief mixed with growing rage. "The little human thinks she can give orders? That's rich. That's actually hilarious." He turned to his packmates, seeking support. "Did you hear that? The pet thinks she's in charge." But his pack wasn't laughing. Cheeksa, in particular, was watching Luna with the keen attention of a predator, recognizing something dangerous in what appeared to be harmless prey. The other Kethrin students shifted uncomfortably, their instincts apparently picking up signals their conscious minds couldn't quite process. "I'm waiting," Luna said calmly, as if Grax's posturing was merely a minor delay in completing necessary business. Grax's amusement evaporated instantly. "You're waiting? For what, exactly? For me to take orders from something that wouldn't last 5 minutes on my homeworld?" "I'm waiting for you to remember where you are," Luna replied, her voice carrying an undertone that made several students involuntarily straighten. "This isn't your homeworld, Grax. This is the Intergalactic Academy, where beings from across the galaxy come to learn how civilization actually works." "Civilization?" Grax spat, literally spat, leaving a wet mark on the floor near Luna's feet. "Your human civilization? The species that can't even survive on most worlds without artificial environments?" Luna's smile was small and completely devoid of warmth. "The species that's managed to establish diplomatic relations with every major galactic power without conquering a single planet through force. The species that's been invited to join every peacekeeping mission in the last 50 years. The species that other civilizations call when they need someone who can actually solve problems, instead of just breaking things." The words hit their target with surgical precision. Grax's species was notoriously excluded from peacekeeping operations precisely because their solution to most problems involved violence. It was a sore point in Kethrin's society, and Luna had just pressed it with the casual cruelty of someone who knew exactly where to strike. "We don't need to be peacekeepers," Grax growled, but there was less conviction in his voice now. "We're warriors. We take what we need." "And what has that gotten you?" Luna asked, tilting her head with apparent curiosity. "Your species controls exactly 4 star systems, all of them resource-poor. You're constantly involved in border skirmishes with your neighbors. Your economy depends entirely on mercenary work for other civilizations. Meanwhile, humans have been offered full membership in the Galactic Council after only 2 centuries of contact." Every word was factually accurate, and every fact was a dagger to Kethrin pride. Grax's fur was standing on end now, his massive frame trembling with barely controlled rage. But Luna wasn't finished. You want to know the difference between strength and power, Grax? Strength is what you use to intimidate students who can't fight back. Power is what lets humans sit at the same table as species that could destroy our entire world with a single fleet. Professor Veltar was watching this exchange with growing amazement, apparently recognizing that he was witnessing a masterclass in psychological warfare. The other students seemed equally transfixed, watching a human systematically dismantle a Catherine's worldview using nothing but words and uncomfortable truths. You think you can just talk your way out of everything? Grax asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You think words matter when claws and fangs are involved? Luna's expression shifted slightly, and for the first time since the confrontation began, she looked genuinely amused. You really don't know anything about humans, do you? I know enough, Grax snarled. Weak. Soft. No natural weapons. No enhanced strength. No instinctive pack tactics. Your species survived by hiding and running. My grandfather, Luna said conversationally, once told me about a war on Earth. Human against human, over territory and resources. One side had better weapons, better armor, better training. They conquered most of a continent in just a few months. Grax's eyes narrowed, unsure where this was going but sensing a trap. But then winter came, Luna continued, and those superior warriors found themselves fighting an enemy that didn't care about their advanced tactics or superior firepower. The cold killed more of them than bullets ever did. The locals, who knew how to survive in their own environment, picked them off one by one. By the end, the mighty conquering army was begging for mercy from farmers and factory workers. She took a step closer to Grax, close enough that she had to crane her neck to meet his eyes. You want to know what humans are really good at? We're good at surviving things that should kill us. We're good at turning our weaknesses into strengths. And we're very, very good at making our enemies defeat themselves. Grax was breathing hard now, his predator instincts warring with growing uncertainty. This wasn't how prey was supposed to behave. Prey was supposed to run, or cower, or submit. It wasn't supposed to stand there calmly explaining why the predator was about to lose. You're bluffing, he said, but there was a question in his voice now. Am I? Luna asked. Let me tell you something else about humans, Grax. We don't just learn from our own mistakes. We learn from everyone else's mistakes, too. Do you know what happens to Catherine cubs who show disrespect to authority figures on your homeworld? Grax's eyes widened slightly. He knew exactly what happened, and it wasn't pleasant. They're exiled from the pack, Luna continued relentlessly, stripped of their clan name, forbidden from participating in hunts or mating rituals. They become outcasts, forced to survive alone until they either die or prove themselves worthy of redemption. The accuracy of her knowledge clearly shook him. This wasn't information that most off-worlders possessed about Catherine culture. But here's the interesting part, Luna said, her voice dropping to match his earlier whisper. The Academy has agreements with every member species about disciplinary procedures. When a student violates the cultural taboos of their own people, the Academy is authorized to implement traditional punishment protocols. Grax's face went pale beneath his fur. The implications were staggering. If Luna was right, if the Academy could actually exile him, according to Catherine law, he wouldn't just be expelled from school. He'd be cast out from his entire society, marked as an outcast for the rest of his life. You're lying, he said, but his voice cracked slightly on the words. Check the student handbook, Luna suggested helpfully. Section 19, subsection 4. Cultural disciplinary protocols. I read it during orientation week. Amazing what you can learn when you actually pay attention to the rules instead of assuming you're above them. Professor Veltar's expression had shifted from shock to something approaching awe. Clearly, he was familiar with the protocols Luna was citing, and, equally clearly, he was realizing that this human student had just demonstrated a more thorough understanding of Academy policy than most faculty members possessed. Grax looked around the room desperately, seeking support from his packmates, but found only worried faces staring back at him. Even his most loyal followers were beginning to edge away, instinctively distancing themselves from someone who might be about to become a pariah. "So here's how this is going to work," Luna said, her voice returning to that calm, conversational tone that somehow made her words even more intimidating. "You're going to apologize to Professor Veltar. You're going to apologize to Nimble for threatening her. You're going to help me reconstruct the research you destroyed. And you're going to do all of this right now before I decide to file a formal complaint with the Academy administration." The ultimatum hung in the air like a sword over Grax's head. Everyone in the room understood that this was the moment of truth, the point where he would either submit to a human's authority or double down on his aggression and face the consequences. But Luna wasn't finished dismantling his worldview. She had one more card to play, and it was going to hurt. "You know what the really pathetic part is, Grax," she said, her voice carrying just enough sympathy to make the words even more cutting. "You actually believe your own propaganda about Catherine's superiority. But I've been watching you for weeks, and you want to know what I see?" Grax's breathing was becoming labored, his massive chest heaving with barely controlled rage. His claws had extended slightly, scraping against the metal of his desk with sounds that made several students wince. "I see a scared little cub who's so desperate to prove he belongs that he'll attack anyone smaller than himself. I see someone who thinks volume equals authority, who confuses intimidation with leadership. I see a bully who's never had to face an opponent who wasn't already afraid of him." Each word was precisely chosen, calibrated to strike at the foundations of everything Grax believed about himself. Luna had clearly been studying Catherine psychology as thoroughly as she'd studied their cultural protocols. "But here's the thing that really gives you away," she continued, taking another step closer despite the obvious danger. "A real alpha wouldn't need to prove their dominance by destroying a student's homework. A real warrior wouldn't threaten someone half their size just to make themselves feel bigger. And a real Catherine wouldn't snarl at a respected professor just because they got called out for acting like a spoiled child." Grax's packmates were now actively backing away from him, their body language clearly indicating they no longer considered him their leader. Kiksa, in particular, was watching him with the cold calculation of someone reassessing their social alliances. "You're not an alpha, Grax," Luna said with devastating finality. "You're not even a good follower. You're just a loud, angry teenager who thinks he can solve every problem with his claws." The psychological assassination was complete. Every foundation of Grax's self-image had been systematically demolished by a human who had done nothing more than point out uncomfortable truths. In the space of a few minutes, Luna had reduced a dominant predator to exactly what he'd always secretly feared he was: a pretender, a fake, a wannabe warrior playing at being something he could never truly become. Professor Veltar was staring at Luna with something approaching religious awe. In decades of diplomatic service, he had never seen anyone so thoroughly destroy an opponent's position using only words and logic. It was like watching a master surgeon perform an operation, each cut precise and purposeful. The other students seemed equally mesmerized. Nimble had stopped crying and was watching with wide, fascinated eyes. Vex's mandibles had gone completely still, his compound eyes fixed on the confrontation with rapt attention. Even Boom, usually absorbed in his own work, had set aside his assignment to observe what was clearly a historic moment. And through it all, Luna remained perfectly calm, her posture relaxed, her expression almost bored. She looked like someone waiting for a late transport, not someone who had just psychologically eviscerated a dangerous predator in front of witnesses. Grax's response, when it finally came, was as predictable as it was catastrophic. "Enough!" he roared, his voice shaking the very walls of the classroom. Every civilized pretense, finally stripped away, every social conditioning abandoned in favor of pure primal rage. Grax chose poorly. Again. With a roar that shook the classroom fixtures, he lunged forward, all pretense of civilized behavior finally abandoned. His massive claws extended, his fangs bared, every inch of his considerable frame focused on the small human who had dared to challenge his dominance. It was exactly what Luna had been waiting for. What happened next would be analyzed in academy combat training courses for decades to come, though most instructors would struggle to explain exactly how a human who weighed less than half her opponent's mass managed to turn a predator's charge into a lesson in physics. Luna didn't move backward. She didn't raise her hands in defense or cry out for help. Instead, she took one small step to her left and dropped into a crouch that seemed almost casual, like someone picking up a dropped stylus. Grax, committed to his trajectory by several hundred kilograms of angry Catherine momentum, found himself grabbing at empty air where Luna had been a microsecond earlier. His claws scraped harmlessly through the space she'd occupied, his fangs snapped shut on nothing, and his considerable bulk continued forward with all the grace of a runaway cargo hauler. The crash when he hit the floor was spectacular. Tables scattered, chairs went flying, and the holographic display projector sparked once before dying completely. Grax slid across the polished deck plating with a sound like ripping fabric, coming to rest in an undignified heap against the far wall. Luna straightened up, brushed imaginary dust from her uniform, and looked down at the stunned Catherine with an expression of mild disappointment. "And that," she said conversationally, "is why humans survived long enough to develop space travel. We don't fight the avalanche. We just get out of its way and let gravity do the work." The classroom was so quiet that the hum of the life support systems sounded like thunder. Every student, every breathing apparatus, every piece of electronic equipment seemed to be holding its breath in the wake of what they'd just witnessed. Grax lay motionless for several seconds, apparently trying to process how his surefire attack had resulted in him eating deck plating while his target remained completely unharmed. When he finally pushed himself up on his forearms, there was something different in his eyes. The arrogant confidence was gone, replaced by something much more dangerous. Wounded pride mixed with desperate fury. "Lucky!" he snarled, spitting out what might have been blood, or just bruised dignity. That was just lucky. "Was it?" Luna asked mildly. "Want to try again?" For a moment, it looked like he might actually take her up on the offer. His muscles bunched, his claws found purchase on the deck plating, and every line of his body screamed violent intent. But then, something stopped him. Perhaps the memory of how easily she'd avoided his first attack, or maybe just the dawning realization that he'd already humiliated himself beyond redemption. "I thought not," Luna said, when he made no move to rise. "So let's try this again. You have approximately 30 seconds to apologize to Professor Veltar before I call Academy security and explain how you attacked a fellow student without provocation." You manipulated me, Grax accused, his voice thick with shame and rage. You goaded me into attacking you. Luna's smile was sharp enough to cut Crystal. I used words, Grax. If that's all it takes to make you lose control and resort to violence, then you're proving my point about who's really qualified to be a leader here. Professor Veltar finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak than his usual harmonic tones. Miss Luna, while I appreciate your intervention, perhaps we should contact the authorities and— No need, Luna interrupted, not taking her eyes off Grax. This is a teaching moment. Grax here is about to demonstrate that he can learn from his mistakes. Aren't you, Grax? The Catherine cub pushed himself into a sitting position, his massive frame trembling with emotions he couldn't quite name. Humiliation, certainly. Rage, without question. But underneath it all was something he'd never experienced before. Genuine fear. Not of physical harm, but of the consequences of his own actions. For the first time in his young life, Grax was faced with the reality that strength without wisdom was just elaborate stupidity. That intimidation without respect was worthless. That all his natural advantages meant nothing if he couldn't control himself long enough to use them effectively. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. Other students watched with fascination as the classroom's former alpha struggled with concepts that challenged everything he'd been taught about power and dominance. Finally, slowly, Grax climbed to his feet. His movements were careful, controlled, none of the fluid, predatory grace he'd displayed earlier. When he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that several students had to lean forward to hear him. Professor Veltar, he said, the words seeming to cause him physical pain. I apologize for my disrespectful behavior. My actions were inappropriate and brought shame to both myself and my species. The formal phrasing was clearly something he'd been taught for situations exactly like this, though he'd probably never imagined actually having to use it. Professor Veltar's scales shifted through several colors before settling on a soft blue that indicated cautious acceptance. Your apology is acknowledged, Mr. Grax, the professor replied carefully, though I believe you have other amends to make. Grax turned toward Nimble, who was still pressed against the far wall like a small feathered statue. I apologize for threatening you, he said, his voice even quieter now. You did nothing to deserve my anger, and I had no right to make you afraid. The little Nimari student nodded quickly, her crest fluttering with nervous energy. She didn't speak, but the terror was slowly leaving her large eyes. Finally, Grax faced Luna. The two of them stood there for a long moment, predator and human, strength and intelligence, old ways and new possibilities. When he spoke, there was something in his voice that might have been respect. I apologize for destroying your research, and for underestimating you. Luna nodded solemnly. Apology accepted. And Grax? The next time you feel the urge to prove your dominance by attacking someone smaller than yourself, remember this moment. Remember that true strength isn't about who you can intimidate. It's about who you choose to protect. The lesson that followed was unlike any in Academy history. Professor Veltar, apparently deciding that the day's events had provided enough material for several semesters' worth of analysis, turned the remainder of the class into an open discussion about power dynamics, respect, and the difference between authority earned and authority demanded. Students who had never spoken up before found their voices. Nimble, emboldened by Luna's example, shared insights about her species' approach to conflict resolution. Vex discussed the Vorthak concept of collective strength versus individual dominance. Even Boom contributed thoughts about how his people's philosophy of gentle giants had served them well in galactic relations. But the most surprising contribution came from Kiksa, who stood up and addressed her fellow Kethrin with words that would be quoted in diplomatic circles for years to come. "We have been taught that strength is everything," she said, her voice carrying across the classroom with newfound authority. "But perhaps we have been confusing strength with stubbornness, power with loudness, leadership with bullying. Maybe it's time we learned what humans have always known, that the greatest victories are won not by those who can destroy, but by those who choose to build." As the class ended and students began filing out, Luna found herself approached by Professor Veltar. The Altarian educator's expression was complex, mixing gratitude with professional curiosity and no small amount of awe. "Miss Luna," he said in his harmonic voice, "that was perhaps the most effective demonstration of conflict resolution I have ever witnessed. Where did you learn such techniques?" Luna's smile was modest, almost shy. "My grandfather used to say that the best way to win a fight is to make your opponent defeat themselves. He learned that during his time as a military instructor. Turns out the principle works just as well in classrooms as it does on battlefields." As she gathered her belongings, including the pieces of her broken datapad, which Grax had quietly collected and placed on her desk, Luna reflected on the day's events. She'd come to the academy to learn about other species and cultures, but perhaps she'd ended up teaching something even more valuable: that intelligence, patience, and understanding could be just as powerful as claws and fangs. Behind her, Grax was having a quiet conversation with his packmates, his voice subdued but thoughtful. The dynamic had shifted permanently, and everyone in the room understood that something fundamental had changed in their little corner of the galaxy. Sometimes, Luna thought, the most important lessons weren't the ones you planned to teach,